All right, well, let's go ahead and get started here. Welcome everybody to this talk, Accelerating Big Data Implementations for the Connected World. My name is John Mertic, Director of ODPI. And I'm really hoping the takeaway that you come from this talk is just understanding, data is just growing, the needs are growing, and for enterprises to continue to adopt this, sustainability is really the key. And so if you're keeping track at home, you'll hear me say sustainable about 100 times, but I think it's a really core concept to really where big data is going. And to kick off, I kind of found this really interesting slide here that just talked about the data explosion, and this is even an out-of-date slide. You thought big data was big when it was said that years ago. Thanks to all of these fancy Internet of Things devices going on, the amount of data generated is just getting exponential. I was looking at CES earlier this year that, there was always, they do all these kind of interesting product announcements. And here were a couple ones that were really, I guess you could label them crazy. The people that probably made them didn't think so. Colby Era Smart Toothbrush. So a toothbrush that is actually collecting data on how you're brushing your teeth effectively. And giving you tips and feedback on better ways to do it more effectively, right? High Mirror, a smart beauty mirror that looks as you're doing, probably more for women, I would imagine, doing your makeup and giving you tips on, the types of products to use and things to consider and things like that. This one's actually somewhat useful, at least in my family. Smarter's Fridge Cam. So a cam that goes in your fridge and scans for items that are going bad. So then when you're at the grocery or the market, you can say, I don't have grapes because all my grapes have gone moldy. Maybe I should get some new ones, right? Or the Zeek Smart Pillow that helps, monitor your sleep patterns and helps give you advice that way. This was the one that I thought was the most interesting. The Keratis Hair Coach, a smart hairbrush that gives you tips on managing your hair better, right? So now that we're having to collect tips on how to do your hair, how to do your makeup, how to sleep, and to make sure your stuff isn't rotting in your fridge, big data is getting big. And it's not in the big way that we always used to think it, right? I mean, everything in big data has always been described in terms of the 3 Vs, volume, velocity, variety. That's not even the problem anymore. Like, we've kind of solved that as a community, right? Now, it's where it's at. Like, IoT has forced us to deal with data where it's at. We don't have that data center luxury anymore, So now we're thinking not just about volume, but about, location, and about distribution and how to deal with this data in that sort of context. It's completely different than how we would have thought about it even just, 3 or 4 years ago, right? And that infrastructure, right? We've heard, a little bit of conversation about things like logical data warehouse and things like that. You can't hug your infrastructure anymore. I mean, cloud was sort of you could argue is the first disruptor of that, but the reality is you're using a lot of different infrastructures to manage this data. You're using your own, you're using several cloud providers. Some of these are strung out all over the world in different sites. It's just not as trivial as that. And the considerations are moving less to, how can I process the size, but how can I process the location of where it's at? How can I kind of get that data locality and those pieces solved, right? So it's interesting sort of the shift we've had here as this connected world has emerged. Nonetheless, you still have 3 real questions. Anytime you're doing a data project, no matter what, you're always starting at these areas of consideration. What's my problem? What's my data? And what questions are I needing to answer? Every company every organization that's looking at a data problem, they're always starting in this sort of construct here, right? I could do a talk on all 3 of these. That would be well over 40 minutes if I tried to pop it into one. I think there's a 40 or more minute session for each of these. I'm just going to focus on that middle one here today, right? Because we're going to be talking a little bit more on the infrastructure side of things and how the role Hadoop plays within it. If we look at Hadoop, it's we all know this, right? It's the data strategy now. It's not, it started as sort of a point solution for doing smarter batch processing, and now, it's handled all sort of areas of the stack. And it's really helped, evolve and hit that problem number 2 that we talked about earlier. What's my data I have available? We got lots of vendors doing this. Everybody always hears the kind of the fun, cases of the Amazons and the Facebooks and that. But average companies are doing this too. I'm in Ohio. Come from Ohio. We have a big insurance provider there, Progressive Insurance. You probably haven't heard of them here in Europe because they're mostly U.S. based. They're one of the pioneers of putting a device in cars to collect data on driving to help better provide insurance quotes to people. They, as of like 2 or 3 years ago, they said they'd collected something like 10 billion miles of data, or 10 billion, not miles of data, it's kind of an odd way to measure it, 10 billion miles of driving data that they have collected over these years, all through a device that they pop in your car. Without tools like Hadoop, they wouldn't be able to process that. 15 years ago, they wouldn't have processed this with a standard EDW setup. It just wouldn't have happened very well. Now, these strategies have come in here and made it a lot easier. But when you sort of look at an enterprise in there, what's been the adoption, right? So if we have if we have all these companies, they're doing great things with it. Clearly, we should be really far. Like this, we should have people all over the place adopting it. Yet, if we look at a Gartner hype cycle to say where we're at, we're kind of in between that early adopter, early majority area. We're kind of, we're still having people that are very early on kicking the tires with us. And you'd think after 10 years, we'd be a little bit farther along. Well, why is that? So I like to sort of think in terms of deployment continuums, and the top here is generally, if you look at any sort of technology, these are sort of the stages that you run through as you're deploying it within an enterprise, right? It starts in a lab where you're sort of playing with a little bit. You're still trying to figure out maybe a bit of your problem you're trying to solve a bit. And then once you're starting to get that hardened up a little bit, now you're starting to move more into a POC where you're actually getting end users trying it. You're getting a look and feel, seeing if it's helping answer the questions you're trying to answer. And then it starts to roll out from a pilot of just a limited group of people actually really using it to something that's at a departmental level. And then finally, enterprise-wide deployment. So I like to call it like it's the size of you're rolling out an ERP system, in other words. And as you sort of move through these stages, there's different things that you sort of have to solve, right? So in the early stages, you're very focused on how is this looking? How is somebody interacting with it, right? And then you're looking at, okay, how is the data, on the back end being accessed? So I'm starting to ask sort of the data question of where's my data coming from? How am I able to deal with it? And how am I interacting with it? But then what's interesting is you get into the later stages, and now you're getting into more of like a DevOps, IT ops question, right? These are the things that, if you look at a mode 1 IT, so these are the people that are helping maintain stable IT infrastructures, they're asking questions around storage. And more importantly, how is it managed? Where is it located? What is the costs that are going to be involved with that? And then the fun, ugly one that really ends up being a lot of blockers, that data security and governance question, right? You have HIPAA regulations, you have German privacy laws that you have to deal with. How are you managing that? How are you managing where that data locality is set up with? How am I able to put into place the right governance things so that I understand who's accessing at what levels, and if I need to do obfuscated data, I can do that. That, in our experience, as you start to get into that production and kind of past that point solution specifically, we see a lot of Hadoop sort of ends there. And I don't want to say ends as in, it goes away and is, banned to the oblivion, but, these solutions don't get deployed farther than that in many, many cases. I think Gartner puts the number here of the gating between data security governance out to that enterprise-wide deployment. It's something like 15% in the Fortune 500. So it's a really interesting, dilemma. And, if you nail down into that a little bit, when we're talking about these needs, these are the things that we're thinking about here. So just some of the base level things from security, which there's Apache projects that definitely do a lot of it. But policies, entitlement, risk profiles, things like that get a little bit deeper, right? Get a little bit more complex, especially as you have a lot of different point systems you're trying to hook into. And the same with the governance, right? Some basic things within there, but then as we're talking hooking into multiple back-end systems, legacy ERP, legacy CRM, IoT, based data, things get a lot more complex, right? Net, data ops requirements for Hadoop and for these technologies, they get a lot tighter as that deployment goes enterprise-wide. You get that's where a lot of the big questions, start to come in very quickly. Let's look at a few details of that, right? So, if we're at if we just look at deployment types, right? When you're in lab and you're early on, you're just doing whatever you can get this up and going with. If it's cloud, great, spin it up, right? If it's hardware I already have that I can get provisioned quickly, great, spin it up. Well, when you're going enterprise-wide, all of a sudden, there's guidelines you're having to play into, right? That's a shift that's happening. Just in the security and data governance, right? If you're just doing, just a lab and limited production, kind of those early stages there, you're thinking of, hey, if there's issues with potential, data security or privacy, let's just mask out that data, or just restrict the users that you can even touch this. Like, just keep it, focused towards them. We go enterprise-wide. Lots of people in the enterprise are going to touch this data. How do you manage that? And the same goes forth here. Life cycle management, same thing. The same thing continues to apply here, right? The uses change, the end considerations change, and it becomes a lot more complex. And the challenge that we've seen a lot is these enterprise-wide production concerns, they oftentimes have a lot of challenges working their way back upstream into the projects, right? So if we look at, and there was a build on this at one point, so pretend like you don't see the ODPI thing for a moment, and then I'll tease it out. In the past, how, an end user of this technology would interact with it, they would be working with their platform vendors. Their platform vendors were that center of truth, that group there that helped them make sense of all of this. And they were sort of the ones that worked back with the upstream projects, typically, right? And that still is very much the case today. But what we've started to find, and this is something I've seen for a number of years, is you end up having really two classes of customers. You're going to have ones that are say, hey, what comes off the shelf from a vendor? That's perfectly fine for my needs. And I saw this a lot when I was in the CRM space a number of years ago. I just need kind of, the standard of what everyone else has works great for me, right? But then there's this other sort of class of customers, and they look at it as they say, you know what, a unique value thing for me is how I engage my customer. Right? And that is on a lot of different levels. A lot of it is just the personnel and the employees and things I have. But the other half of it is those back-end systems that help power it. And that the more that those systems can be unique differentiators for me, the more that they enable my organization to execute better, that's a technology investment that I'm willing to put extra money in towards. So I get out of the mode of saying, hey, I'm just not buying a product, but I'm looking at buying a platform. And I'm looking more at some of these open source components here that I can have a play in, I can have a piece of, right? There was an article by John Mark Walter, who is an evangelist for Red Hat, and he throws out the term software supply chain, which I really like, because if you think in, for those of you who think in like supply chain management, it's the concept of you understand all of the pieces that come to be that make up the product you're trying to be. And the companies who are best at executing and managing that supply chain, they're able to get products out in predictable ways, they're able to get things out in record time, and oftentimes they have lower levels of defects because they understand all of the pieces in there and they're able to optimize for that. Same holds true for software. Vendors that understand all of the pieces that their software is coming through and that they're being able to be active participants on, they're able to use that as a differentiator. They're able to use that to reduce risk. They're able to use that to increase the satisfaction that they have within their organizations. And this is a lot of where ODPI for us comes in. We looked at this ecosystem and we said, hey, the biggest challenge is there's great ideas that are at that end user ISV level. And it's challenging for them to get into upstream projects because upstream projects speak in code. They say, hey, if you have a problem with this, either talk to a vendor or submit a pull request. But these folks down here might not even know where the pull request needs to go. I mean, the average Hadoop distro has between 25 and 30 projects in it. So where do you even know where to start? But furthermore, to be able to have the Karma to participate in those projects, you have to have a pretty good understanding of the inner components of that project itself. ODPI helps. ODPI says, hey, let's talk about things in a more meta sense. Let's talk about things from a higher level. And then let's help direct where those investments need to go from there, right? So it's helping create a different sustainable way of executing, right? It's not simply for somebody relying on the vendor. Now all of a sudden we're creating this different path here. We're creating this better path here and helping build a community around it. So why add this feedback loop? Well, everyone here uses these tools. I bet the concept of these things are non-trivial probably rings true to everybody. And to a degree, that's sort of by design. These are hard things. These are hard concepts. So they are non-trivial. The deployment patterns, we talked about this from the enterprise, they don't always make it upstream. There's a lot of stuff that stays knowledge with an organization, and that knowledge doesn't always make it upstream very easily. And the interoperability, yes, all of these things draw from the same Hadoop projects, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's a lot of consistency there. And there's no downstream forcing function to help draw that consistency back. So this is where a feedback loop comes in handy. And the interoperability and the inconsistency, it's not necessarily an across-the-board thing, but it ends up being on critical things. And it's the surprises that I think most organizations and even vendors we talk to, it just sort of, it drives them nuts. One vendor we've worked with in the past, they used to say, hey, you know what, we find every new Hadoop release that comes, whether it's from a Cloudera or Hortonworks or a MapR or whomever, we find little trivial things that change. And it's not big things, but it's enough that we have to spend QA time and go fix it. And we have to account for that. And because of that, we have to shift more of our investment into sustaining engineering, and then we have to take away from the investment that we're already making in enhancing our product more, right? That's a common thread we hear here, right? So, helping, inconsistency is one, but just predictability, I think, is a larger piece of that too. So, how are we kind of making this happen, right? And so, us as believers of open source, we see as the community as a structure that makes this happen. The one thing that we've added at ODPI new this year is special interest groups. And the concept behind this is, just like I talked about in a few slides ago about getting that feedback loop, this is sort of the first step of it. This is here where communities are coming together and discussing topical issues that are all pertaining to them. So for example, we have a data security and governance SIG that's exactly talking about the issues there, both from an end user perspective, both from a product integration perspective, and where they look to come together. And we have a few other SIGs as well in data science and Spark and fast streaming data. They come together and they say, hey, look, this is what we see as the opportunities in this space. This is we see some of the challenges. This is some of the risks. And here are some of the recommendations that we think could make this better. And then that stuff, and I apologize, you would think this all works linear, but you're going to have to make a mental leap over to the TSC here. That feedback goes into the TSC, and they figure out, okay, how do we execute on this? Is this helping catalyze and getting some upstream code contributed to projects, right? Is this helping build some best practices guides and just helping say, hey, if you're doing X, these are good solid ways that we've seen the industry do it and our models to emulate. And then part of it might be, a series of, compliance and other sort of tests or specs, which is something we've traditionally done here at ODPI, that helps just establish a baseline of, this is what you should expect. This is the baseline of what you should take in. All of these sort of pieces here, we push into PMCs that actually do the execution work. And that's from developers and whatnot that are actually helping build these pieces. The sort of other angle within there is the UAB, and that is a group of end users that just work with us and advise us on, what's the things they're seeing in the organization, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, and as they look at trends across the industry, what is their take on it? We've actually found some really unique insights from there. I think one of the most recent ones, and there's going to be an article coming out this in a couple of weeks, is specifically around the usage of big data in the cloud. If you read all of the trade mags, the big thing is saying Hadoop is moving to the cloud as fast as humanly possible, and anybody who still has an on-premise Hadoop is crazy. And as we talk to end customers, that's not exactly the true dynamic out there, right? There's a much more of a hybrid play going on, and depending upon what you're doing, both have their place, right? It also isn't the first time we've ever heard that cloud is destroying everything. Anybody who owns their own computer is dead, but that's for beers later. So this is kind of the structure we look at, and these are the things we put in place. And this here, helps enterprises help establish that feedback loop, which that feedback loop helps put in place their ability to help manage that software supply chain and gives them a lot of long-term consistency and stability. So the other piece here we have that we've put in place is this compliance program. And again, this aligns really well with helping establish trust in the industry. We really what this ends up doing is saying, hey, here's a set of Hadoop platforms that, yes, we have that same level of expectation that when I'm encountering it, I know certain things are always to be true. And then a set of vendors that, more than just a normal partner program where they say, yes, we ran the tests, it all works, but having that ongoing commitment to saying, hey, we think this is important enough to have this level of best practices of how you're interacting with applications that we're committing that ongoing, we're going to keep doing this. We're going to make sure that this is important. And we've already seen a few successes in there. I've talked with IBM a few times, and they said, hey, we've been able to talk this message to some of our customers, or some new customers, actually, some Hortonworks customers, and say, hey, look, we have products, and because of the ODPI compliance that we have in here, we're able to work together, right? And this is a long-term thing that you have a degree of trust that, you investing in this product and me investing in this, we're going to continue to help as these standards evolve to make sure that we're always in compliance, right? And so this helps just reduce that constant duplicate effort out there. This is just saying, all of these vendors working together and saying, hey, these base level standards are what you should expect. We agree to, and that's what we're writing to. And so we have programs there that sort of help drive that really nicely. And in the end of the day, it comes back to this sustainability. This is a great chart that I've stolen from very many Linux Foundation's presentations, but it's the philosophy of how we see open source, of how it connects all of this together. Within a project sense, projects are created because of a joint interest in this technology. But in the end of the day, these projects are used as the basis for building great products to sell. And those products, based upon what the market viability of them, define investment back into the project, right? It's that same sort of cycle there. You invest in these projects because you see value as it helps you go to market. And then as the success of you going to market, you continue to have that same investment. This same thing applies for everyone downstream as well. So if I'm an end user of this technology, me investing in these projects helps me as an organization execute better, gives me a sense of security, and helps sort of feed that sustainability thing. And as those projects are successful, you continue to invest, right? And This ends up being sort of a very key thing. Early in my career, I was a Visual Fox Pro programmer. I won't ask anybody to raise their hands if they used it before. I don't want to embarrass them. But it was a popular technology, late 90s or whatever. And there was a company that invested on building an accounting system on top of it, mostly for the front end of it. They used SQL Server on the back end. But they'd poured, millions of dollars in over time of this. They had a huge customer base they had built up, right? A lot of success. One day, Microsoft decides, you know what? We're killing Visual Fox Pro. We're not developing it anymore, and anybody who's on it needs to move off of it because we're not putting any more support in for it. That whole company basically had, a huge shift that they had to do. And by having that proprietary technology that they invested so much to as an underpinning, they were stuck. Versus the model here, investing in those base open source things, hey, maybe, the community and the rest of the world wants to move on and do something different. But if you have that ability to continue to invest back in those projects, you're helping cement and control and put a sense of trust in that software lifecycle that you're thinking about there, and you're actually helping control where your supply chain is going there. That's a pretty valuable thing. And as an end, it's very clear where that story comes from an end user, but or from a vendor rather. But as an end user, if I'm looking at investing in technologies and I don't want to have to be dependent upon my vendor to solve all of my problems for me, and I want to feel like, hey, I have a path to go where I can help participate, the same cycle makes a lot of sense. So. Anyways, if this ODPI thing, the things I've been talking with sound even remotely interesting, there's a couple different ways you participate. And by the way, these aren't necessarily things that mean, hey, you have to get your whole corporation on board. These are things that you can just go do, right? You can join any of our SIG groups. They're free to anybody to join. And we really encourage a lot of diverse participation in there. You can read more about them at the URL on there. You can see what we're doing in the ODPI spec side. We just did a release today. Of our updated spec, and one of the nice things we did there is we actually aligned with the Big Top community, so the deliverables in terms of a testing infrastructure and a reference implementation, it's actually based off of Big Top 1.2, so you can go check all that out up on GitHub. If you're an end user of this technology, we have a user advisory board where we not only we communicate back and forth, but there's also a little bit of a sense of, we just started it a couple months ago, but there's a little bit of a community actually building in there of people who are practitioners in this space, communicating back and forth, sharing some of the challenges and opportunities that they're seeing. You can talk with me about it or also go on the web and learn a little bit more. And the last one, I guess, is probably more of a company sort of thing. You can join ODPI, but I would encourage you really try 1 through 3 first. Like, just get a feel for it, see what we're doing, see if what we're doing sort of aligns and makes sense with the things that you're thinking about. And as that goes forward here, maybe look to join ODPI, which will help get you an ability you can make your solution ODPI compliant. So with that, I think I'm literally almost at time, but I think I have like 2 or 3 minutes, something like that. 3, excellent. Any questions? Wow, a talk that ends with no questions. That I did a really good job, or everyone tuned me out. I'm gonna say the first. All right, well, I'll be around here a little bit after this talk and for the rest of the day, and happy to chat with anybody. So thank you.